A pleasant day to you all. Today we will be discussing Erik Erikson's identity theory. This video presentation will also cover Erik Erikson's famous psychosocial development theory, a short biography of his life, and as well as how his study still applies today.
Let's talk about the life of Erik Erikson. First is a personality identity crisis. Erikson was born in Frankfurt, Germany. His Danish mother, from a wealthy Jewish family, had married several years earlier, but her husband disappeared within hours of the wedding. She became pregnant by another man and was sent to Germany to give birth in order to avoid the social disgrace of having a child out of wedlock. Despite his pleading her for years, she never told her son who his father was. She remained in Germany after the baby was born and married Dr. Theodor Homburger, the infant's pediatrician. Eric did not know how for some years that Homburger was not his biological father and said that he grew up unsure of his name and psychological identity. He kept the surname Hamburger until age 37 when he became a U.S. citizen and changed his name to Homburger Erikson. Another crisis of identity occurred when Erik started school. Despite his Danish parentage, he considered himself German, but his German classmates rejected him because his mother and stepfather are Jewish. His Jewish classmates rejected him because he was tall and blond and had Aryan facial features. He earned mediocre grades, but he showed some talent of art. After graduating from high school, he used that ability to try to establish an identity. Next is dropping out society. Erikson dropped out of conventional society and traveled extensively in Europe, reading, recording his thoughts in a notebook, and observing life around him. He described himself as morbidly sensitive and neurotic, even close to psychotic. Becoming a Freudian. At the age of 25, Erikson received an offer to teach at a small school in Vienna that had been established for the children of Sigmund Freud's patients and friends. Freud was attracting patients from all over the world. Being wealthy, they moved to Vienna with their families for the duration of their psychoanalysis. Erikson later confessed that he was drawn to Freud in part because of his search for a father. It was then Erikson's professional career began and he felt that he had finally found an identity. Next is Free Marriage and Stable Foundation. In 1929, a masquerade ball in Vienna, Erikson met Joanne Serson, a Canadian-born artist and dancer who had been analyzed by one of Freud's disciples. They fell in love, but when she became pregnant, Erikson refused to marry her. She told her that he was afraid to make a permanent commitment and that his mother and stepfather would not approve a daughter-in-law who was not Jewish. Only the intercession of friends persuaded him that if he did not marry Joanne, he would be repeating the behavior pattern of the man who had fathered him and condemning his child to the stigma of illegitimacy which Erikson himself felt so keenly. Next is Coming to America. In 1933, recognizing the growing Nazi menace, the Eriksons immigrated to Denmark and then to the US or United States, settling in Boston. Erikson established a private psychoanalytic practice specializing in the treatment of children. He also worked at a guidance center for emotionally disturbed delinquents and served on the staff of Massachusetts General Hospital. Erikson began graduate work at Harvard, intending to get a PhD in psychology, but he failed his first course and dropped out of school. In 1936, with no academic degree, he was invited to the Institute of Human Relations at Yale, where he taught in the medical school and continued his psychoanalytic work with children. Erikson and a Yale anthropologist collaborated on a study of the child rearing practices of South Dakota's Sioux Indians. Honors and accolades, but no identity. In his observations of American Indians in South Dakota and in California, Erikson noted certain psychological symptoms that could not be explained by orthodox Freudian theory. The symptoms appeared to be related to a sense of alienation from cultural traditions and resulted in the lack of a clear self-image or self-identity. This phenomenon, which Erikson initially called identity confusion, was similar to the condition he had observed among emotionally disturbed veterans after World War II. Erikson suggested that those men were not suffering from repressed conflicts, but rather than confusion brought about by traumatic war experience and by being temporarily uprooted from their culture. Next, he had described the veterans' situation as a confusion of identity about whom and what they were. In 1950, Erikson joined the Austen Riggs Center in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, which was a treatment facility for emotionally disturbed adolescents. 10 years later, he returned to Harvard to teach a graduate seminar and a popular undergraduate course on the human lifestyle, retiring in 1970. At the age of 84, Erikson published a book about old age. Even after a lifetime accomplishments, honors, and accolades, however, his daughter wrote that he felt disappointed with what he had achieved. It was still a source of shame to this celebrated man that he had been a illegitimate child. Psychosocial stages of personality development. Erikson divided the growth of the personality into 8 psychosocial stages, by which were modified from Sigmund Freud's theory of psychosexual stages. First is psychosocial stages of development. To Erikson, 8 successive stages encompassing the lifespan. At each stage, we must cope with a crisis in either an adaptive or a maladaptive way. Next is the role of genetics in the environment. Erikson suggested that the developmental process was governed by what he called epigenetic principle of maturation. When we say epigenetic principle of maturation, it is the idea that human development is governed by a sequence of stages that depend on genetic hereditary factors. Next is conflicts and crisis. In Erikson's theory, human development involves a series of personal conflicts. The potential for these conflicts exists at birth as innate predispositions, and of each will become prominent at different stages when our environment demands certain adaptations. Each confrontation with our environment is called a crisis. Crisis is, for Erikson, this refers to the turning point faced at each developmental stage. The last one is adaptive coping. Erikson believed that the ego must incorporate both maladaptive as well as adaptive ways of coping. For example, in infancy, the first stage of psychosocial development, we can respond to the crisis of helplessness and dependency by developing a sense of trust or a sense of mistrust. Trust, the more adaptive, desirable way of coping, it is obviously the healthier psychological attitude. Yet each of us must also develop some degree of mistrust as a form of protection. If we are totally trusting and gullible, we will be vulnerable to other people's attempts to deceive, mislead, or manipulate us. Ideally, at every stage of development, the ego will consist primarily of the positive or adaptive attitude that but will be balanced by some portion of the negative attitude. Only then can the crisis be considered satisfactorily resolved. So, basic strengths. Erikson also proposed that each of the 8 psychosocial stages provide an opportunity to develop our basic strengths. These strengths or virtues emerge once the crisis has been resolved satisfactorily. For Erikson, these are motivating characteristics and beliefs that derive from the satisfactory resolution of the crisis at each developmental stage. Next is trust versus mistrust. Erikson's oral sensory stage of psychosocial development, paralleling Freud's oral stage, occurs during our first year of life, the time of our greatest helplessness. The infant is totally dependent on the mother or primary caregiver for survival, security, and affection. First, it's up to the mother. If the mother responds appropriately to the baby's physical needs and provides ample affection, love, and security, then infants will develop a sense of trust and an attitude that will characterize the growing child's view of themselves and others. In this way, we learn to expect consistency, continuity, and sameness from the other people and situations in our environment. Is up to the mother. Trust can be lost later in life. Although the pattern of trust and mistrust is a dimension of personality is set in infancy, the problem may reappear at a later development stage. Hope. The basic strength of hope is associated with the successful resolution of the crisis during the oral stage. Under of basic strengths are also autonomy versus doubt and shame. During the muscular anal stage, at the second and third years of life corresponding to Freud's anal stage, children rapidly develop a variety of physical and mental abilities and are able to do many things for themselves. They learn to communicate more effectively and to walk, climb, push, pull, and hold on to an object or let it go. Children take pride in these skills and usually want to do as much as possible for themselves. Choice. The most important point about this stage is that for the first time, children are able to experience some choice, to experience the power of their autonomous will. The toilet training crisis. The major crisis between parent and child at this age typically involves toilet training, seen as first instance when society attempts to regulate an instinctual need. The child is taught to hold on and let go only at appropriate times and places. Parents may permit the child to proceed with toilet training at his or her own pace or may become annoyed. In the latter case, parents may deny the children's free will by forcing the training, showing impatience and anger when the child does not behave correctly. Third is will. The basic strength that develops from autonomy is will, which involves a determination to exercise freedom of choice and self-restraint in the face of society's demand. Initiative versus guilt. The locomotor genital stage, which occurs between ages 3 and 5, is similar to the phallic stage in Freud's system. Motor and mental abilities are continuing to develop, and children can accomplish more on their own. They express a strong desire to take the initiative in any activities. Oedipal relationship. One initiative that may develop is in the form of fantasies manifested in the desire to possess the parent of the opposite sex and establish a rivalry with the parent of the same sex. Purpose. The basic strength called purpose arises from initiative. Purpose involves the courage of envision and pursue goals. Industriousness versus inferiority. Erikson's latency stage of psychosocial development, which occurs from ages 6 to 11, corresponds to Freud's latency period. The child begins school and is exposed to new social influences. Ideally, both at home and at school, the child learns good work and study habits, which Erikson referred to as industriousness, primarily as a means of getting praise and satisfaction from successfully completing a task. Under ng industriousness and versus inferiority is developing new skills. The child growing powers of deductive reasoning and the ability to play by rules lead to the deliberate refinement of the skills displayed in building skills or building things. Competence. The basic strength that emerged from industriousness during latency stage is competence. It involves the exertion of skill and intelligence in pursuing and completing the task. The final 4 developmental stage. The outcome of the crisis at each of the first 4 childhood stages depends on other people. The resolution is a function more of what is done to children than of what they can do for themselves. Identity cohesion versus role confusion. Adolescence between ages 12 and 18 is the stage at which we must meet and resolve the crisis of our basic ego identity. This is when we form our self-image or the integration of our ideas about ourselves and about what others think of us. If this process is resolved satisfactorily, the result is a consistent and congruent picture. When we say ego identity, it is a self-image formed during adolescence that integrates our ideas of what we are and what we want to be. The identity crisis. People who emerge from this stage with a strong sense of self-identity are equipped to face adulthood with certainty and confidence. Those who fail to achieve a cohesive identity, who experience what Erikson called an identity crisis, will exhibit a confusion of roles. They do not know who are or what they are, where they belong, or where they want to go. Identity crisis is a failure to achieve ego identity during adolescence. Fidelity. The basic strength that should develop during adolescence is fidelity, which emerge from a cohesive ego identity. Fidelity encompasses sincerity, genuineness, and a sense of duty in a relationship with other people. Okay, intimacy versus isolation. Erikson considered young adulthood to be a longer stage than the previous ones, extending from the end of adolescence about the age of 35. During this period, we establish our independence from our parents and quasi-parental institutions such as college and begin to function more autonomously as mature, responsible adults. We undertake some form of productive work and establish intimate relationship, typically close friendships and sexual unions. Caring and commitment. In Erikson's view, intimacy was not restricted to sexual relationships, but also encompassed feelings of caring and commitment. This emotion could be displayed openly without resorting to self-protective or defensive mechanism and without fear of losing our sense of self-identity. We can merge our identity with someone else without submerging or losing it in the process. Love. The basic strength that emerged from the intimacy of the young adult years is love, which Erikson considered to be the greatest of all human virtues. He described it as a mutual devotion in a shared identity, the fusing of oneself with another person. Generativity versus stagnation. Adulthood, approximately ages 35 to 55, is a stage of maturity in which we need to be actively involved in teaching and guiding the next generation. These needs extend beyond our immediate family. Care. Care is the basic strength that emerged from generativity in adulthood. Erikson defined care as a broad concern for others and believed it was manifested in the need to teach, not only to help others but also to fulfill one's identity. Okay, ego integrity versus despair. During the final stage of psychosocial development, maturity and old age, we are confronted with a choice between ego integrity and despair. These attitudes govern the way we evaluate our whole life. Our major endeavors are at or nearing completion. We examine and reflect on life, taking its final measure. If we look back with a sense of fulfillment and satisfaction, believing we have coped with life's victories and failures, then we are said to possess the ego integrity. So Erikson's own final stage. At 84, Erikson reported the result of a long-term study of 29 people in their 80s on whom life story data had been collected since 1928. The book, Vital Involvement in Old Age, indicates in its title Erikson's prescription for achieving ego integrity. Okay. Wisdom. The basic strength associated with this final development stage is wisdom. Deriving from ego integrity, wisdom is expressed in a detached concern with the whole life or the whole of life. It is conveyed through succeeding generations in an integration of experience best described by the word heritage. So after the basic strengths, we have basic weaknesses. Basic weaknesses, similar to the way basic strengths arise at each stage of psychosocial development, so may basic weaknesses. We saw earlier that the adaptive and maladaptive ways of coping with the crisis at each stage of life are incorporated into the ego identity in a kind of creative balance. Although the ego should consist primarily of the adaptive attitude, it will also contain a share of the negative attitude. Basic weaknesses, motivating characteristic that derive from the unsatisfactory resolution of developmental crisis. Maladaptive and malignant condition. In an unbalanced development, the ego consists solely of one attitude, either the adaptive or the maladaptive one. Erikson labeled this condition maldevelopment. Only the positive adaptive tendency is present in the ego, the condition is said to be maladaptive. When only the negative tendency is present, the condition is called malignant. Maladaptions can lead to neurosis. Malignancies can lead to psychosis. Erikson believed that both conditions could be corrected through psychotherapy. Maladaptions, which are the less severe disturbance, can also be relieved through a process of readaptation, aided by environmental changes, supportive social relationships, or successful adaptation at a later developmental age. Maldevelopment, a condition that occurs when the ego consists solely for a single way of coping with conflict.
Questions about human nature. Human nature is the concept that there are a set of characteristics, including ways of thinking, feeling, and behaving that all normal human beings have in common. Human beings are full of potential or common traits. Erikson believes that although not everyone is successful in attaining hope, purpose, wisdom, and the other virtues, well, we all have the potential to do so. Individual strengths and weaknesses vary. Vary. We deal with our own separate reality. What we have, others may not same with our mindsets. Erikson's optimistic view of human nature tell us that psychological growth, although centered on a crisis, offers the possibility of a positive outcome. Even if we fail at one stage and develop a maladaptive response or a basic weakness, there is hope for change at a later stage. We learn as we grow. Each stage of development has its own way of teaching us how we can do things better, how we can change to be better. It's a never ending learning session with ourselves. Change is inevitable, though maturity itself, when it comes to our mental and psychological aspects, differ from one another. He believed that we have potential to consciously direct and shape our growth throughout our lives. For example, stories of children who are products of broken families and any form of abuses and neglect tends to do better later in life. Despite of their hardship on their early years, they never let those burdens hurdles their growth in general and succeeded in their chosen path. Erikson's theory is only partially deterministic during the first stages of development. Our learnings depend on the people that surround us, like our parents, teachers, and friends. We tend to conform with the norms and limit our space for personal growth. We exercise our free wills more later in life when we are old enough to make decisions on our own, experienced enough not to conform with the norms but to put our own thoughts, beliefs, and principles. We have to remember that we have different experiences and turning points. In general, Erikson's believed that personality is affected more by learning and experience than by heredity. Nurture versus nature. Some of us learn by doing things on our own. We learn from our experiences and from others as well. We learn from our environment, our society in general. Our ultimate overriding goal is to develop positive ego identity that incorporates all the basic strengths. Ego identity is a having strong sense of self which is manifested by a confident awareness of one's enduring characteristics. For instance, a person with a healthy ego identity is knowledgeable of his strengths, weaknesses, fashion, philosophy, and life, and the kind of environment which he may thrive. Assessment on Erikson's theory. The key idea in Erikson's theory is that the individual faces a conflict at each stage which may or may not be successfully resolved within that stage. Erikson agreed with a certain Freud's theoretical formulation, but he differed from Freud in his methods of assessing personality. For example, instead of Freud's psychoanalytic coach, he promotes a more personal relationship between therapist and patient and to ensure that they view each other as equals. Erikson preferred that patient and the therapist face one another while seated in comfortable chairs. He believed that assessment techniques should be selected and modified to fit the unique requirements of the individual patients. In general, Erikson respects Freud's theoretical formulation, but disagrees with his methods of assessing a client. He argues about individuality and the uniqueness. One client is different from the other. What works for one doesn't mean it will work for the others as well. Erikson's theory is more comprehensive than Freud because of his lifespan approach from birth to death. He also focuses more on human development, environmental factors, and social interaction. One of the strengths of psychosocial theory is that it provides a broad framework from each view to develop throughout the entire lifespan. It also allows to emphasize the social nature of human beings and the important influence that social relationships have on development. Play therapy plays the natural language of children and it's a metaphor or a symbolic expression of what is going on in their lives. Play is to children what verbalization is to adults. Early childhood experts agree that play is essential and facilitates. Number one, expressive language. Two, communication skills. Three, emotional development. Four, social skill. Five, decision making skills. Six, cognitive development. Erik Erikson, an expert in human growth and development, defines play as a situation in which a child can work through experiences by creating model situation and master reality through planning and experimentation. Play offers opportunities for self-expression, mastery, and growth in a way that fits the child's development level. Toy and other materials play a role in the therapeutic process. If play is considered the language of children, the toy are their words. Children in play therapy are able to choose from an array of toys. They are given the power to determine the toys to use and how to use the toys most of the time. The form and intensity of play reveal aspects of personality that might not be manifested verbally because of child limited powers of verbal expression. Some of potential benefits of play therapy are: one, taking more responsibility for certain behavior; two, developing coping strategies and creative; three, problem solving skill; four, self respect; five, empathy and respect for others, alleviation for anxiety; six, learning to fully experience and express feeling; a stronger social skill; eight, stronger family relationships. Psychohistorical analysis. Erikson considered individual development and functioning within family, community, and cultural contexts, recognizing biological forces. Erikson's psychohistories typically focus on a significant crisis, an episode that represents a major life theme, uniting past, present, and future activities. Discipline subjectivity used by Erikson is interesting in the sense that by studying his clients' biographical stories, he can understand his or her perspective about a certain viewpoint. As I mentioned earlier, in his studies, people experience vary. Others might find things odd, but others find it normal. We might deal with similar problems, but our approach and solution will always differ. Psychological tests. Although Erikson's did not use psychological tests for personality assessment, several instruments were developed later based on his formulation. 1. The ego. Identity scale is designed to measure the development of ego identity during adolescence. 2. The ego identity process questionnaire. Also for adolescents contains 32 items to measure the dimension of exploration and commitment. 3. The Loyola Generativity Scale is a 20-item self-report inventory to measure the level of generativity or stagnation in adulthood.
So now let us head on over to the research on Erik Erikson's theory. So first off, Erikson's primary research approach was case study, which he employed to get thorough or deeper knowledge of certain events. However, case studies have a variety of advantages as well as disadvantages, according to Erikson, but they give a lot of useful information for the client. The first research that was made on one of Erikson's concepts was play construction. Erikson used play therapy to conduct research on his theory, focusing on what he called play constructions. So, to be exact, Erikson defines play constructions as a personality assessment technique for children in which structures assembled from dolls, blocks, or other toys are analyzed. So, for example, in his one study, boys and girls from ages 10 to 12 were asked to construct a scene from an imaginary movie using dolls, toy animals, toy cars, and wooden blocks. The girls tended to build static, peaceful scenes that contained low and close structures, while intruders would try to force their way into the interiors. By contrast, the boys focused on exteriors, action, and height. Their creations tended to be an action-oriented with tall towering structures and cars and people in motion. So linked to Erikson's concept of play constructions is connected to gender preference for toys. For more than 50 years after Erikson's theory on play constructions, traditional gender stereotyping with regards to toys and play behaviors persist. Most children still prefer gender-based toys. Boys typically play with trucks, soldiers, and guns, whereas girls typically play with dolls, jewelry, and toy kitchen implements. So from a study by Wong and Hines 2014, their study consisted of 2 to 4-year-olds found that boys played more with a toy train than with a doll, whereas girls chose to play with the doll and not with the train. Similar results occurred with college students. Men were attracted to a so-called boys' toy, a model fighter jet plane, but only when it was painted blue. They rejected the object when it was first painted with pink, a traditional girl's color. And this was a study by Danilia, Devita, and Wastegram. So another factor that is connected to play constructions are the role of parents in determining gender preference for toys. So these patterns of toy preferences are still taught and encouraged by some parents, who purchase most of their young children's toys. Parents praise children for playing with the appropriate gender-type toy and discourage them from playing with toys or intended for the other sex. And this study is well supported by a research by Query 1998. Fathers treat boys and girls in a more stereotypical way than mothers do. Therefore, it is primarily the fathers who teach and reinforce gender-based play. They also instruct their sons, daughters, and other gender-type behaviors and attitudes. Fathers tend to encourage and reward passive, compliant, and behaviors in girls and assertive, aggressive behaviors in boys. Lastly, we have trust, security. Erikson emphasized the importance of developing an early sense of trust if we are to achieve feelings of security and well-being later in life. Studies of infants aged 12 to 18 months old showed that those who had strong emotional bond with their mothers functioned well or better, when observed 3 years later at a higher social and emotional level than infants whose attachments to their mothers was less secure. Children with a well-developed sense of trust were also more curious, sociable, popular, They were more likely to be leaders at games and showed greater sensitivity to the needs and feelings of others. Those low in trust were more withdrawn socially and emotionally, reluctant to play with other children, less curious, and less forceful in pursuing goals. Next, we have a research on psychosocial stages of Erik Erikson. When children aged 4, 8, and 11 were asked to make up stories based on several test pictures, the stories given were then analyzed to determine which psychosocial stage they would reflect on. So first we have adaptive and maladaptive development. A study by Constantinople used an inventory of psychosocial development, a test designed to assess adaptive and maladaptive development in Erikson's first 6 stages. Found a significant relationship between happiness and adaptive development at each stage. Another research study by Raymanis found or showed a high correlation between maladaptive development in the first 6 stages and a sense of alienation and uprootedness. Another study by Galambos, Barker, and Krant from 2006 support these studies from another study of their own with adults ages 18 to 25 in Canada, which found that the period of emerging adulthood was a time of increased psychological well-being. Next, we have the effects of growing up. Psychologists Waterman, Bubel, and Waterman in 1970 study tested Erikson's belief that positive outcomes in resolving the identity crisis are related to a positive outcome at prior developmental stages. Adolescents who develop trust, autonomy, initiative, and industrious in the first 4 stages of psychosocial development displayed a high level of identity cohesion rather than role confusion. Adolescents who had not resolved their identity crisis and who experienced role confusion had not developed adaptive ways of coping in the earlier stages. Next research on Erikson's study, we have adolescent development. From an extensive research program on the adolescent stage of development, identified 5 psychosocial types or statutes for that period. These are identity achievement, moratorium, foreclosure, identity diffusion, and alienated achievement. So let's start with identity achievement. Identity achievement describes adolescents who are committed to occupational and ideological choices. A study of college students found a positive correlation between achieved identity status and objective measures of commitment. And this is a study by Straight Matter. These studies had developed a strong ego identity. The students described in that study were stable, concerned with realistic goals, and were able to cope with changing environmental demands. They performed better on difficult tasks than adolescents experiencing role confusion, and these stable adolescents majored in more difficult areas in college, attracted to courses in engineering and physical sciences. There's also evidence that adolescents who thought seriously about what they wanted to do with their lives and so were more likely to achieve an identity, had parents who provided direction and control in a loving and caring way, in contrast to parents who were either too permissive or too authoritarian. Similar conclusions were also found in a similar study of Iranian college students. Those least likely to reach identity achievement had parents who were either too authoritarian or too permissive in their child-rearing behavior. This is a study from Mohammadi, 2013. Next, we have moratorium, and this is the second adolescent status, which describes people who are still undergoing their identity crisis. Their occupational and ideological commitments are vague. They hold ambivalent views toward authority figures. alternately rebelling and needing guidance from them. Their behavior ranges from indecisive to active and creative, and they score high in anxiety. A study by Bill Skur and Marcia also stated that they also tend to daydream, believe in supernatural phenomena, and enjoy behaving childishly. Next research topic, we have sex differences in ego identity. Sex differences have been found in the resolution of the identity crisis. Men in one study showed a tendency towards separation and detachment from other people, whereas women showed a tendency toward a connection and attachment to others. Meanwhile, other studies support and extend that finding, showing that male identity focuses on individual competence and knowledge, whereas female identity is more centered on relating to other people. So therefore, when women establish an identity, they depend heavily on social relationships. Men, on the other hand, focus more on self and individual skills and abilities. This was a study from Curry. Data from teenagers in the Netherlands also suggests that female adolescents form an identity at an earlier age compared to men adolescents, but that most males achieve some level of identity by the end of the teen years. Indeed, it is a stressful time to search for identity. As you may well know, adolescence can be a turbulent and stressful period. 3 key elements for this developmental stage have been identified. First, we have conflict with parents, which characterizes by a forceful resistance to adult authority. Next, we have mood disruption, characterized by a volatile emotional life, mood swings, and episodes of depression. And lastly, we have risky behaviors, characterized by reckless, rule-breaking, and antisocial behavior that may harm themselves and others. A study supports this after tracking individuals from childhood to adolescence, which found that many of those who experienced depression and other emotional problems during the teen years had also suffered some form of psychological distress when they were children. This suggests that difficulties reported in adolescents do not necessarily arise because of adolescence. Lastly, under sex differences and ego identity, we have virtual identity. Computer games and social media sites offer adolescents a unique and high-tech opportunity to do precisely what Erikson said was so necessary at the developmental stage: to try different roles to see which offers the best fit. And this is exemplified in a role-playing games such as Second Life and Dungeons and Dragons, which allowed young people to take on fictional personas to act out complex fantasies. Next, we have maturity. Reflecting on our lives, Erikson believed that people in the maturity and old age stage of psychosocial development spend time recalling and examining their lives, accepting and regretting past choices. A study of older psychologists found that most of their memories were of college and early adult years, the period involving the greatest number of critical decisions that affected the course of their lives. Gender differences in aging states that it is more difficult for women compared to men to engage in a dispassionate process of reflection or taking stock of life, as described by Erikson. This was demonstrated in a research involving adults in their 60s. Men reported much higher levels of identity, certainty, confidence, and power compared to what women did. This was a research study by Miner, Rubino, Winter, and Stewart. In addition, women tend to live longer than men, so they are more likely to have to deal with issues of illness and incapacity, bereavement, loss of social support, and reduced income. This may contribute to the observation that women's retrospective reviews of their lives are often less positive compared to men. and are more likely to lead to the condition Erikson noted as despair in later years, rather than ego integrity. Another research refers to racial and ethnic identity. One aspect of ego development not considered by Erikson is the impact of racial identity and its positive benefits. Let's talk about the benefits of racial identity. Research on this topic consistently shows the importance of developing and maintaining a racial or ethnic identity for minority groups. Denying one's racial identity can be stressful. Many studies of Latino, Asian, and Black teenagers in the United States, Hong Kong, and Canada show clearly that a strong ethnic identity is related to psychological well-being, high self-esteem, strong social bonds, satisfaction with life, and good academic motivation. The next research that we have on Erikson refers to gender preference identity. Another aspect of ego identity not directly addressed by Erikson is gender preference identity, which has an impact on total ego identity and varies according to ethnic identity. According to a study of white, black, Hispanic children, average ages 11, Black and Hispanic children are subjected to significantly stronger gender conformity pressure than white children. Now let's talk about stages of identity. Researchers have claimed that lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgender identity develops over a series of stages, similar to how Erikson described the formation or development of ego identity or ethnic identity. A model which listed 4 stages in the development of gender preference identity explains them as so. For the first stage, we have sensitization. Prior to adolescence, this stage describes one's initial perception of being distinct from peers of the same sex. After that, we have the stage which we refer to as identity confusion. In this stage of adolescence, this is characterized by the confusing and, if not, terrifying realization that one's feelings and thoughts may be characterized as homosexual. Next, we have the stage identity assumption. Throughout this stage, the individual begins to embrace the beginnings of a gay identity and believes he or she is homosexual. For the last stage, we have commitment. At this point, the individual accepts his or her gay identity as a way of life. Now let's talk about the reflections on Erikson's theory. First, we have the contributions and criticism Erikson received during his time. Erikson significantly expanded most of Freud's concepts, which led to a great contribution of knowledge in psychology, some of which were Erikson's addition of the lifespan approach, as well as his studies linked to cultural, social, and historical forces which may greatly influence an individual's development. And until today, most of his work has proven significantly helped in practice by professionals. But along with great contributions include notable criticisms towards his theory and concepts. Some experts refer to his ambiguous terms, research with little to lack of evidence, and the deficiency of precision. There were also some criticism directed at his artistic temperament and lack of scientific expertise. Although Erikson agreed with the critics, he replied by saying, "I came to psychology from art," which may explain, if not justify, the fact that at times the reader will find me painting context and backgrounds where he would rather have me point to facts and concepts. Another came from social psychologist Carol Dervis, from his claims about the applicability of these psychosocial stages towards sex differences. Rooted from his position on play constructions, which was linked to cultural related differences, this gave attention to how Erikson's theory could not have constant applications since it may not be applicable to women. The flack that Erikson received was from the applicability of his personality theory, The critic stated that Erikson's theory was unapplicable to individuals in less fortunate economic circumstance to afford a moratorium during adolescence. Moratorium, as mentioned early on, refers to a needed factor to develop one's ego identity. Lastly, for recognition and influence, Erikson's views and ideas have been well received by both professionals and the general public during his time. Back then, Time magazine, which is known as a famous American news magazine, recognized him as the most influential living psychoanalyst during March 17, 1975. In addition, another praise came from Psychology Today, a media organization focused on psychology and human behavior, who stated that Erikson is an authentic intellectual hero. Erikson's approach is credited for igniting the area of lifespan developmental psychology, which has experienced a great surge in study and theory in recent years, as well as a present interest in developmental difficulties in middle and old age. Another notable contribution was Erikson's method of play therapy, which has become a useful diagnostic and therapeutic tool for helping emotionally disturbed and mistreated children. But besides this, his concepts have proven to be significant help as well with education, social work, vocational and marriage counseling, and clinical treatment with children and adolescents, all of which had benefited greatly from his ideas. This concludes our video regarding Erik Erikson's identity theory. Thank you for watching.